My name is Nicky Ni, and I'm a Chicago-based curator and researcher interested in real-time simulations, sort of time-based art, and was a co-founder and still kind of editor of a Chicago-based gallery called Lithium. We ran for 2 years before we closed down, and now it's going to be a website. So this is just a little bit about me, and I'm gonna present a presentation together with Martha Poggioli over here, and who has already done a presentation yesterday. I'm gonna do the first half, and then she do the second half, and then we're gonna convene and answer questions and talk about things. So it's gonna be a kind of casual talk presentation. I didn't write anything, I read it out loud. So some of the ideas are half-baked, so I really appreciate any kind of criticism and ideas, because hopefully it can be turned into a paper in the future. So that's kind of the premise for this presentation. And so yeah, our topic's called Really Uncanny Bodies. And it really began with Martha's exhibition, solo exhibition at the XSC last year in November. And it was called Rational Behavior, and it showed 4 new works that Martha produced over the summer. And then one of the work that you're seeing here, it's called With Lips Wanting for Kisses. I'm just gonna talk about this work, and then Martha is gonna talk more about the show later in her presentation. So this is actually a work that has a CGI reference. It's kind of obscure at this point, but you'll be able to see in the next slide, which I can show you quickly. It comes from a body of research that Martha did that she thinks about the CPR menu that she saw with Summer Expo, and then in the CPR menu that you see here, and those are the gloves. And then she actually took the gloves out and then put into work. This is about 11.5 inch by 17 inches, and then you see the floating hands that are gestured from the brochure. So I actually wrote about the exhibition, and then here's just a little paragraph to give you an idea. In Poggioli's recent exhibition, Rational Behavior, the artist shows a few new works inspired by the CPR menu distributed by the American Heart Association. The pamphlet shows a series of computer-generated 3D figures wearing baby blue latex gloves that showcase the recommended procedure of conducting CPR. Perplexed by how behaviors of digital bodies in simulation infiltrate real life, the artist isolates the hands in animation, takes their 2D contours and makes them into 3D objects by adding a thickness to the 2D shapes. The material reincarnation results in a herd of abstract hand-shaped creatures, all in a specific blue that alludes to the surgical gloves the computer-generated figures wear. So to our next slides, that's what you see. I actually haven't seen this Wallicar or a series of print reproductions in person, but it's just a thing I found online. And this is actually the artist's original scan from the pamphlet, which you can get like a closer view of the 2 figures. So I just want to do like a very basic formal analysis of the figures. They are very interesting color dynamics here, and relatively realistic modeling of the characters compared to examples that you'll see in next slides. And then you see some of the shadings and the volumes and sleeves and the gestures and the angle of the viewpoint. So when Martha mentioned this to me, my first gut reaction is that this has to come from an animation. Even though like I couldn't really find any obvious YouTube links to it, I just had a feeling that there's an animation that precedes these such images. And then just to give you like kind of a general CPR overview, like some of the figures that are normally being illustrated, or you can see here, you're actually using real actors to do the scenario. And then in the case of children, you have where's my mouse? You have a real person. When you approach the case of infant, it's really hard to find actual infant, so you use a tool instead for obvious practical reasons. And this is actually another brochure produced by the American Heart Association in 2010. So the one that you first saw in a couple of slides before, that was produced in 2015. So this is actually a previous version of it. And you can kind of see from the CGI and how this, like a rougher version of the characters due to certain computer technologies. But this is, again, I believe, another CGI scenario. Oh, and then I want to point to you like how different the lady is. Again. That she looks more like a normal person versus the last one that they are really like professional medics. And she's not wearing gloves. But the color scheme is similar. Oh, yeah. So my gut feeling kind of really launched this research into the animation that I'm hoping for, and then I found it. I'm just going to show you a 1-minute clip.
Safe. And make sure the person is lying on his back on a firm, flat surface. Tap and shout to see if the person is responsive. If the person is unresponsive, shout for help. Sir, are you okay? Are you okay? Help, help, I need help. If someone comes, have that person phone 911 and get an AED. You phone 911 and get an AED. If no one comes to help and you have a cell phone, phone 911. Put it on speaker mode so you can hear the dispatcher's instructions and begin CPR. You will also need to get the AED yourself. Next, scan the chest for 5 to 10 seconds, checking for breathing. If the person is not breathing normally or is only gasping, he needs CPR.
There are like different segments to show the full process of giving the CPR, and they involve multiple characters, male, female, different racial identities. So there's some juicy stuff over there which I couldn't really cover, but going back to the presentation, I just want to give you a tiny little overview of the medical simulation. It doesn't really concern my topic here, but I thought it's related. Basically, very, very basic. So simulation in technological sense, comes from the flight simulator that was used in the World War II. So basically, it was invented around 1930s and was really used between 30 to 50. And then I think the first medical simulator came from, their predecessor was the flight simulator, but then they, the first time when it was used used on anesthesia, so that less patients get, like in real situations that you want to prevent the death of the patient, so you want to practice on the simulator. So it can be clinical or surgical. Clinical meaning, for example, this guy, like you do physical things on it and then it has a certain response to it. Whereas surgical is really to see the inside of the body and then to simulate, for example, I don't really have an example in mind, but you kind of get the idea, like when you go inside the body and then to do the surgery inside. And then since the 1990s, the medical simulations really has been widely used for education and training purposes. And fidelity is definitely a very important factor in here because it's less about how the simulators look like. For example, this guy is very much not a person, but it's more so to emphasis on the physical interaction or interactivity between the trainee and the simulated patient. And I just want to give you a very famous example. This is the Resusciani. Apparently, she's one of the most kissed anonymous girl because she was drowned when she was 16 in Paris. That was late 19th century. She was found, and then no one knew what her name was. And she had a death mask then made after her death. And then around maybe 1950s to 60s, when there's the thing about potential having a tool for practicing CPR, her face and like together with the mask just got found, and then she was resuscitated for the first time and made into tools. And now many of the early version of the the victims or the CPR simulators are actually after her facial features. So yeah, and there's a fun fact. It's the Norwegian toy manufacturer Asmund Leidal that actually first produced the Resusci Annie, and then she actually stressed that it has to be a female victim because male in the 1960s might not want to kiss a male. I thought that's something interesting to share. And then I read a paper that talks about the interaction between the trainee and the simulator, meaning that it doesn't really matter what the simulator looks like or the physical features of it, but it's more so the interaction and then how you can embody the feeling of resuscitating someone when you're proceeding with the process. So coming back to this images, and like after all the formal analysis and the angle that you just saw in the animation, I think it's, there's something, this is not super supported by anything, but just like my gut feeling, that whenever you encounter a CGI character that's 3D modeled, you tend to think that it was in an animation. At least that's how I feel. Like even in the situation where when everything is so fluctuated with digital images, like moving images, you tend to, and then given how CGI is very prominent in film industry and in the special effect sector of making of feature film, you tend to think that a 3D CGI figure is itself animated. And then there comes my hypothesis of a kind. It's that certain specificity of the medium might dictate a cognitive response to a still 3D CGI image. And then those formal elements of the image suggest the potentiality for movement. Yeah, and then that comes to the uncanny part of it. This is a famous image that everyone knows. But basically, we're talking about CGI figures that in certain situations might start to be uncanny, and they can be different in entertainment situations and in medical contexts. I encountered a paper called Punctum, Animation, Affect, and Ideology that was written in 2013 by Assistant Professor of Communication at U Cincinnati, Eric S. Jenkins, who talks about affect of animation. So, and then he evokes the idea of punctum that originated from Bollenblatt and use punctum to think about animation. So what is the punctum of animation? So for example, brief review of Park's theory is that he specifically talks about photographs. And then to the degree that he was even anti-film, that it has to be a very still photograph that you sometimes encounter details that gives you intense, a subjective reaction. And it might strike you even before you understand or can analyze it. It's a living, so according to Bart, it's a living image of a dead person, someone who has been and is no longer there. And the affect of punctum is felt, and the affect by Deleuze and Guattari's sense is that it's something pre-consciousness and then a pre-rational analysis. So like it's something that hits you before you could even grasp what it is. And then Jenkins used those set of parameters to describe the punctum of animation, thinking that it's actually in movement that the punctum of life is the most prominent, something that never has been the punctum of life that you can see in animation. And he quotes animator Norman McLaren saying that animation is not the art of drawings that move, but rather the art of movements that are drawn. what happens between each frame is more important than what happens on each frame. So despite being non-indexical to real life, meaning something that's in the animation is not necessarily pointing to a particular object in real life, the movement in animation enables that life, and that life can be felt through the succession of still images. So I want to stress that the affect is not equivalent to seeing, say, like a sad emoji and then you feel sad. It's more so something that hits you, like a kind of sadness that you couldn't even grab that it's sadness yet. Something more primordial and pre-consciousness. So that's where I'm thinking in terms of Martha's images from the CPR menu. What does it mean when I feel like those bodies are slightly uncanny? They're not necessarily uncanny when you encounter them in other situations, but when they appear as still images on the CPR menu, there's something going on there that's not quite right. I guess, first of all, the samples I have is not that enough, and then not that many, because people tend not to invest a lot on CPR menu, or animation making is not really profitable, and also the necessity thinking, the menus are more for instructional diagrams versus actually make you feel like it's an animation that you're watching, and then to make you feel empathetic with the characters and whatnot. So, let's see. It's, my speculation is that when the affect of animation bleeds into a situation where images should be read rather than felt, the uncanny is provoked. So the embodiment of the gestures that you're supposed to learn from the animations versus you suddenly feel like those characters are once animated, and because the movement suggested from the way that CGI characters are made, and then feeling empathetic with the animated characters, make you feel like that those characters might come to life, or it's just like you suddenly feel something strange with them. So accidental appearance of liveliness in a situation that's not supposed to be. Right, so that's just like a string of some thoughts that I have on this picture that you see. My talk is more so to prep, so that Martha can talk about her practice, and I just want to conclude with, it's a pretty recently made
Oztuk's closed rhinoplasty operation. Due to improvements in technology, performing rhinoplasty without chisel and surgical hammer is possible. Your nose will be photographed in 8 different angles, and the possible after-surgery look of your nose will be displayed to you in 3D simulation. With closed rhinoplasty technique, nasal humps can be removed. Nose tip can be lifted. In the middle line, nasal septum. Under general anesthesia, with intranasal chisels, upper and lower alar cartilages will be relocated in the middle part. Nasal hump will be removed without hammer by using special equipment. Following this process, nasal bridge will be rasped. After the hump is removed from the nasal bridge, right and left side of the septum will be cut vertically, and then double-sided horizontal cuts will be done at the top of the nasal bone. For achieving an aesthetic side view of the nose, upper side of the lower alar wings will be removed. After this step, cartilage grafts taken from the septum will be relocated either side of the upper septum. The vertical cartilage graft, which will be placed in the nose tip, and lower alar cartilages are shaped with stitches, thus
Thank you, Nikki. I'm Martha Poggioli. I'm an artist based here in Chicago, though I'm actually living up in Wisconsin right now, working out of Cola, making big metal. Some of the work that I'm going to show and that Nikki introduced is like a new line of work, I suppose, and it's very much in parallel to the IED work that I presented yesterday. Do I just like scroll across? Is that how it works? Yeah. Okay. So the active representation of the human form dates back millennia, and it's through contemporaneous material and technological developments that such representations take form to support the continuation and formation of culture and identity. And today, in an increasingly digitized and technologically infiltrated reality, my work as an artist has been concerned with considering the histories and systems and relationships between bodies and objects. So most recently, I've been thinking through this category of bodies and objects that are created purely as simulations of the real. And speaking of the body in this way calls into question the notion of the uncanny valley, which Nicky kind of talked about earlier. And this has really become interesting to me because of my research parallel to the body on medical prosthetic devices, specifically intrauterine devices. And through this line of research, I'm now beginning to think through a lineage of the body as represented in medical, instructional, and communication design material. I'm going to show some images and some collages that are new ideas. It's a little bit haphazard. It kind of jumps around a number of centuries. So I'm starting to think through some new work, and then I'll loop back at the end to the most recent show. So the body can be reformed through external apparatus, whether it be a mirror device that creates a reimagining in the mind's eye, or as a physical device such as this, which is an intrauterine device, and it's kind of shown within the womb, that alters whatever we like to imagine as the natural or original state. One part I have begun to form questions around is what is the slippage between the idealized and the actual, and what is this so-called neutral territory that these texts, objects, medias, and representations attempt to reside within? And how do these objects, simulations, and devices form the construction of identity in an individual and or collective sense? This very much speaks to my own upbringing and formation of identity. And the other part of this thinking is how the plane of time confuses this idea of the body in relationship to technology, and in turn how it begins to form a sort of feedback loop in which representations begin to fold in on themselves. In the case of these images, that could be thought of as kind of gestural symbols that kind of reach across time. So this is a sort of illustration that I'm trying to kind of articulate for myself, and it's still a work in progress. I guess I'm wondering what the connections and relationships are between the idealized thing and the actual thing. I myself get confused when I really begin to break it down. So I guess in this diagram, I'm attempting to explain for myself how it might be to visualize what it is to create an idea or a thing that is then executed. So if we start in the middle, in the present visualized idea in the mind's eye, as soon as we begin to take that idea and that it begins to take form in the mind's eye, it's propelled into an imagined future. And I think that this imagined future can really only be constructed on experience and material from the past. So as it propels forward, it sort of begins to float in like an imagination ether. And as soon as it begins to do this, my thinking is that it immediately gets catapulted backwards through the plane of time to perform a sort of a series of actions, two of which, so the first I'm thinking is that it begins to reference a history of form, a technical application in relationship to its potential execution. And I'm not sure whether or not this is a history that sits inside of the mind's eye of the imaginator, or if it's sitting within like a larger network of history or histories. And then the second thing that it begins to it situates itself within the past, because technology and culture continues to move past the present and into the future. And in this way, perhaps the present visualized idea starts as one thing, but ends up in the past as a sort of fractured relic of its initial imagined version of itself. So the circle becomes the square. So once a thing is reduced to a sort of neutral version of itself, does it stop being itself, or its intended represented thing? That's a question I've been asking. So this document these images are from a text that I've been looking at. It's translated into English, the physiotherapy in gynecology and the mechanical treatment of diseases of the uterus and its appendages by Martha Poggioli. It's a publication that perhaps as an anomaly to the temporal canonical representations of the body, to me, I guess it offers a precursor to the manual therapies that we know today. And the techniques illustrated were developed as an attempt to a non-surgical methodology to treating and correcting physical ailments, with an emphasis on the reproductive organs of the female anatomy. So it was published in 1895. Martha Poggioli was a Swedish physiotherapist, or physical therapist as it's known in the US. And the practice was widely adopted in Europe during the late 19th and early 20th century. And I've actually seen close-ups, like other portions of this text proliferate, sort of being used in other texts later on. This artifact is curious in that its representation of active bodies is entirely genderless in style, and it calls into question a culture and a history of sexuality and reproductive politics. And then within the context of Europe, right at the end of the 19th century, a turbulent time in which nascent material and social constructs of modernity and sexuality were beginning to accelerate, this product, or this text of scientific education, can also be examined to discuss mediums of instructional illustration and design communication, and the way in which their proliferation within contemporary health and wellness practices has continued to develop. What's, so funny to me and probably blatantly obvious to everyone is that the images, like these bodies, stop being bodies as understood in the sort of traditional binary context of like gender, and they're simplified so much so that they begin to resemble an abstract alien-like form. And so I also have this question, like, would these have been called aliens back then? And do these bodies actually form a genesis of what we have come to understand an alien today? If anyone knows anything about this, please let me know, because I haven't been able to find any representations from the same time or earlier that kind of support any other claim. And one might think that these images are like perhaps a lack of technical ability on the behalf of the illustrator. So maybe it's like a simplification that renders the drawings so strange and so abstract. But if we continue onwards through the text, new strategies for representation begin to take form that are rather sophisticated. So this is the same book, but further on. And these images don't lack specificity, so they're very intentional. And so in such a way, the body, or the bodies, are now rendered as objects. So you have two bodies. You have the body of the hands, and then you have the body of the kind of organ and skeletal components. And for me, this does something that's the same but also different from the previous images. It creates a space of neutrality, I think. I don't know what neutrality really is, but so the neutrality, which is perhaps like a call to action through the gestures of the hands that attempt to correct an ailment in this strange logic of the body. So we're at once peering inside and witnessing a sort of scripted performance within the body. And it's sort of in a way that defies logic or actual reality. If we were to sort of like measure the distance between those two hands that are grasping what is the kind of reproductive organs of the female anatomy, I mean, that would be a pretty wide girth. So like, what is this then? Like, what is this? Yes, that's true.
Is it a vaginal massage via the rectum?
I could go back and talk to you about it later. I have the translated version and we could go through and look at exactly what they're indicating in this point, but this is the uterus being like, from my understanding, being corrected. So you can have like a retroverted uterus and you can have these like physical corrections rather than have pessaries inserted. And that's what this is attempting to do. It's rather radical as well because it's suggesting a non-surgical approach and a non-object, like an approach that doesn't actually call for objects to be permanently inserted inside the body. So,
Can you keep talking about neutrality that was?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think neutrality is like an impossible idea, but I'm kind of trying to think through this attempt at neutrality, and I think a lot of these science illustrations, whether or not they're depictions of like full bodies or depictions of like bodies as object components, they're always like attempting at a type of neutrality, which is impossible. And then here we have a histological image of the uterus. And this is a microscopic level image. And these come from the beautiful Atlas of Histology by Svoboda Hammerson. And Svoboda is, I suppose, like the early author or printmaker. And then I believe Hammerson comes into the fold later, perhaps several decades later, as a sort of adjunct contributor. And the Svoboda prints are very early photolithos. They're really beautiful. And the thing that's interesting to me is that they are accumulations, not simply photographic prints. So to my understanding, many of these images are recreated as high-level illustrations, and it's through a collecting of a series of prints or samples from the same site with different subjects. So several uteri have these specimens taken from them, and then prints are taken from them, and then a mean is generated, and a single image is then recreated through illustration. So in this way, there's also another kind of attempt at neutrality, and this is also, so this is 1905, and so this is like a contemporary of the Tour de Brant images. So where to from here, I'm not so sure, but there are endless ways to compare and analyze these historical, instructional, and medical renditions of the body. And to do it in a way that sort of complicates this idea of genepsis, not only as representation, but as simulation of body, technology, and object. So on the right, we have Fritz Kahn's work, where the female body becomes embodied technical drawing. And then on the left, we have an excerpt from the first Western anatomical print document from Vesalius. And then just to loop back to the work that I showed in November that Nicky was speaking about. One of the works, Lovely Love Song, is sort of loosely based on this film, You've Got Mail. I don't know if you've seen it, but I think it's a bit of a classic rom-com. The film itself is actually based on a 1937 Hungarian play, then adapted at least twice during the 1940s, and then once again in its kind of like most recent form. It's like pre-Y2K rom-com, in which two rivals in the real world are unknowingly pen pals. In the pre-internet era versions, they're pen pals, and then in this version, they're like email chat lovers. And so for me, this film is really interesting because it kind of does what I think some of these CGI images do as well. They sort of reach across time and enact this idea of what it is to kind of like experience and re-simulate the same logic. It just kind of continues to repeat itself. So for the show, I created this, it's a hand-blown glass amplifier that sits atop a red pedestal. The color of the red is actually called Lovely Love Song, which is where the work takes its title. And as an assembled form, it emits a looping track of reconstituted audio grabs from the film. And for me, as I said, the film kind of forms part of a contemporary canon that can be considered an oracle to the current Tinder era that we're in which simulated bodies attempt to reach out and connect each other in the real world. And for me, these slippages occur in which the unending human endeavor in which to kind of connect the real and the representational perpetually fold in on each other.
Hi, I'm Kimberly. Hi, I'm Janice.
He stood you up? He stood you up?
There is the dream of someone else. You don't love me.
He's waited until you're primed.
Are you online?
Watching the
Are
film.
you?
It's great. So a CPR training manual distributed by the American Heart Foundation in 2016, at least that's what this version is from, depicts these images of varying human bodies interacting in a demonstrative display of actions involved in performing a rescue. They're constructed simulations of a theoretical alternate reality, one which most actual humans may not ever actually perform, but only imagine. And these objects and these bodies have become interesting to me, so I'm beginning to make work that thinks through the logic of their existence. And as Nicky mentioned, so this work here with Lips Wanting for Kisses, the composition of the entire catalogue of hands from one particular brochure reconstructed, so I 3D modeled them and printed them and formulated them into this work, which is sort of like a schematic for a larger sculpture or installation that I'm working on right now up at Cola. Essentially rearrangeable like players in a game of Battleship. Each of the form makes part of a composition of collected representations of one specific typology. And it's a form of digital hoarding or reconstruction, which is an adaptation of Jen Terry Sayers' prototyping the past methodology, which I sort of spoke about yesterday. And this work is an attempt to move these imagined bodies out of the speculative digital and into the three-dimensional schematic. So I kind of am hoping to bring these into like a one-to-one scale, possibly larger if I can. By also placing the hand into a physical sphere, it sort of sparks associations of object-body paradigm for me. So ubiquitous objects such as disposable teeth cleaners inhabit this kind of parallel object life to the human bodies that they serve. As temporary prosthetic devices, they are perhaps object manifestations of an anthropomorphized convenience. And there's like the obvious color similarities as well. This is also from the exhibition. So materialized miniatures of opposable thumb principle. They appear to dance in a perpetual calendar whilst morphing from 2 to 5 digits and back again. I see these little teeth cleaners as like object cousins to a wide variety of typologies, including the IEDs that I've been researching. And I also see them as kind of the cousins of the hands in the previous work. So for me, they're like disposable, convenient, and emotive, like object animated beings, kind of like the brooms in the Fantasia film that kind of dance around. And finally, an inflated and cast silicone installation, which was also part of the show, that derived from the Thank You plastic bags. It's a typology that's sort of endlessly repeated to the point where it also can be thought of as a species. If you lay the plastic bags next to each other, they're sort of like there are very minute changes that you see in size and color and sort of the graphic specificity. So these are created using a process I've been developing over the last couple of years. The inflatables are made from an adaptation of soft robotics, printmaking and mold making techniques. And for me, they sort of perform, they do a lot of work, I think, to kind of like convey what I'm hoping to convey. They're sort of stretching the possibilities of what the thing can be, either and or body, form, replica, print. So here they're scaled up and reconstituted into these sort of like fleshy bodies that I'm hoping to eventually make breathe. And in this installation, they're sort of like trapped in the architecture, magnetized to the wall. I have like a little clip of it moving. I'm sort of working towards them breathing independently. The goal essentially is to make bodies, like print like human scale bodies of the CPR bodies. So though I'm not making bodies yet, I'm beginning to strategize how to make bodies and how bodies might come into form through the language of my artistic arsenal. How might the strange logic inside of a miniaturized representation be exploited and rescaled to an origin state, whatever that means. This is just like a self-portrait from when I was 15. I had some skeletal issues, and I'm starting to realize that that's probably the genesis of like a lot of my interest in medical imaging. I think this is the one where they made me take like they make you take a liquid and you become, you glow under something technical. I can't remember. What does creating tangible sculpture and prop sculptures, what does that do to confuse and reconstruct assumptions around histories, and how does that further proliferate this feedback loop of repetition and construction? And how can these characters and bodily formations be exploited to form new narratives? And what does that look like to recontextualize them outside of their mundane informational and instructional space? And how might we, I suppose, move them into a cultural sphere for purposes of study, I suppose, or inquiry, to critique maybe, but also to simply just enjoy looking at, imagining through, and then reconstructing once again. That's it, thank you.
Questions, immediate questions? If not, I have a question for Martha.
Sure.
Yeah, because given that you're a sculptor, mainly a sculptor, I'm curious to know how your choice of materials are. Like, I remember you mentioning something about surgical steel that you they make, and just how that, because my focus is kind of on the perception of certain things that can trigger the uncanny, and it manifests itself strictly in visual terms. So, like, sometimes when you spot something that's made in silicone and you know that's silicone. Yeah, and then like I remember you talking about using aluminum, trying to replicate the surgical, but yeah, it's just the materials aspect of things.
Yeah, so I'm like very intentional with the use of materials and techniques. I like to situate the practice by like sort of exploiting the techniques of industrial design materials and practice. So a lot of like CNCing and 3D modeling and materials that are maybe less associated with traditional sculpture and more associated with like object. That's sort of the way that I like to work. And I think I sort of realized this recently, but I think I like to confuse that idea of whether or not it's like a work of art or if it's a product. And sort of what does that do as well? Like these little components that are standing out of this extruded piece of aluminum are completely redrawn and they're derived from the little teeth hand thingies, which I'm kind of endlessly obsessed with because I'm from Australia and I'd never seen these before I moved to the US. And now I see them everywhere, like detritus on the ground. They've sort of become like, I don't know, I see them at certain times and they've kind of started to form this magical association for me. They kind of, I don't know, they expose something for me that I'm not even sure what it means yet. But yeah, I'm trying to also, I think I'm also like participating in this feedback loop by trying to simulate these mass-produced objects. And by simply like, simply, maybe not so simple, to kind of make them look like they're real designed objects. But by simply doing this, I think that the work is then able to say a lot more independently.
Can you talk about how your work relates to prosthetics?
Prosthetics? Yeah. I spoke about it at length yesterday.
Sorry, wasn't there?
But I have been doing a lot of, so this is like all very new work that sort of I really have only developed in the last, I showed this in November, and it's sort of like the beginning of a whole new line of inquiry. But I have been collecting and cataloging patent documents of intrauterine devices. I've also been remaking them, so I went as far back as the Roman era and have been creating 1-to-1 scale replicas of bronze IUDs, and then sort of using them to form sculpture, I suppose. And then the maps are becoming like a way for me to learn through the history, which is almost like a species at this point. I have about 350 objects mapped, which really only starts at the early part of the 1800s. But it's also, the maps are sort of becoming part of the work as well. And I'm really interested in this relationship between the object and the body and how the prosthetic, there's like this slippage between like the prosthetic becoming the body and the body also mirroring the prosthetic, such as in, like, so this is like a collage, which I sort of do these collages to think through some ideas. And this is derived from one specific patent, which is a intrauterine cauterizing device. So the idea is they're very, like, these are like really old patents and some of them are rather grotesque, but this suggests energy is pushed through the object, which is on the right-hand side. And by doing so, it creates scar tissue that closes up the fallopian tubes. But you can see, if you collect and look at enough of these patent drawings, that the uterus, which is essentially like a hollow organ, begins to take form through the kind of insertion or the imagined insertion of the intrauterine device. So, yeah, anything else?
I think it's also good if we talk about, coming from the previous body of research, that's very much object-oriented, and now it's more so for you. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's more of a study of a relationship through the object. That's either one person's body part with other body part of the same person, or it's like two people doing things, and then what triggered that change, and then how did it happen? Yeah.
I think I needed a bit of a break from looking at these objects. While I was a fellow at Oxbow over the summer, I fell in love with the CPR training manual. We all had to, as fellows and staff, had to do this training, and that's sort of where I came across it. And I think I'd sort of been like cataloging anyway, this like parallel history, not in such a intentional way as I have with the IUDs. But now what I'm essentially hoping to do in the future is like draw a line in history between like this gesture and like these hands right here. And also like perhaps start making work that like reconstitutes this like sense of desire that's like suggested through like repositioning these bodies. They're not supposed to be like that. They don't appear as that in the brochure. But if you reconstruct them in a certain way, you can start to build an alternate narrative that could be a love story, for example. It's kind of what I think these guys are doing here.
And I think something that we talked about yesterday about potentially the murals in the Renaissance era could be an instruction.
Yes.
How the animation serves in contemporary time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's.
Yeah, I didn't. Did I not talk about that? No. Maybe I didn't. Instead of looking at the Sistine Chapel as a site of art, I'm sort of thinking of it as a site of instructional design. So during this time, people go to the churches of Europe. I think it's to kind of consume knowledge and to kind of gain a moral and ethical perspective of life. At this time, like the populace doesn't really, it's like a pre-literate populace. It's really only the privileged, educated few who have access to texts and who have the skills to kind of read texts. So people would go to the churches and they would listen to sermons and look at the frescoes to kind of tell stories and listen to stories that would kind of form an understanding of what it is to be a human in the world. So I sort of think of these images and these stories that are on the frescoes, not as works of art, but as works of instructional design. And so for me, repositioning that, I think, is also kind of why I see that there's a lineage there, potentially. So thanks for raising that. I think I didn't talk about that.
I think that's about to conclude where we end. But basically just general, I'm really interested in how images can function not only in art history context, but also in other contexts like medical brochures. And then very few people would see those images to how you see in an aesthetic way, versus most of the studies are done in terms of how effective they are teaching or giving knowledge. So just a general takeaway question. And then we're cool. Great. Thanks so much.